Uh, so I want to thank the Center for the Study of Childhood Art, Chris, Hyan, and Jeff for hosting me and for taking the time to share my ideas. It's a real honor to be included in the Childhood Art Speaker Series. I also want to give a warning, which is not necessarily my practice, but I'd like to share that there are images that some viewers might find troubling, which is exactly what we'll be talking about today. But I just want to give you that warning in case you want to take the moment to opt out of seeing those. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and we'll get started. Can you all see my screen okay? Okay, great. All right. So my paper is titled Thinking with the Border in Early Childhood Art Education. When I moved to the border in the summer of 2016 for a temporary visiting position, my intention was to stay for a short time and then move on to a permanent position. Here I am 8 years later, looking back over what the border has taught me that I didn't know I needed to know. The culture, practices, and politics of the border have asked me to think ideas I would not have thought otherwise, and to rethink others that I had erroneously assumed were fixed, such as my role as educator and researcher, and my assuredness of best practices. It has challenged me to combine and reconsider ideas in order to answer its imperatives. Here, the border is a nexus, a meeting place of like and unlike, and also of ideas. It is characterized by tough questions that beg for our consideration and understanding, and is often a space that demands a different kind of thinking. This talk centers around this kind of thinking, or how the border might teach those on it, along with the rest of the nation, things we might not know that we need to know. At the crux of this epistemology is an important difference in the way that the border is seen by those far and away and those who live it. Underlying the possibility to learn from the border, and likewise from children, is the possibility that things may not be what they seem, and that those who are dedicated to seeing, learning, and being with children and the border might begin to dismantle these taken for granted viewpoints, myths, understandings, and epistemologies to see what understanding and relations can be produced. When I arrived in El Paso, Texas, after completing my dissertation on young children's play and art making, the 2016 presidential election was in full swing, and the border played a significant, although relatively smaller role in former President Trump's campaign. On the national stage, Mexico and Mexicans, and by proxy, Mexican Americans, were characterized by a slew of intolerable epithets meant to foment populist sentiment, using rhetoric recalling the culture wars of the 1980s and 90s. This would foreshadow things to come, including the present political situation in which funding for Ukraine and Israel would be leveraged against border politics meant to control the narrative of presidential election issues. The reporting and often sensationalization of the border for the instigation of and political benefit of others in distant, far-off places largely served to shape the national and geopolitical perception of the border and the people that live here. For instance, last year, as news outlets televised the caravan of migrants supposedly overwhelming the border, my sister-in-law, on a phone call from Philadelphia and curious about the situation, asked if we were being overrun by migrants like the media was depicting. My reply was, of course, no, and that the national media had created a border crisis of migrant visibility that contradicted the experience of the day-to-day life living and working on the border. Certainly, there are many places where the migrant crisis is felt more strongly, but it's important to consider how the strategies of visibility and movement, like those that the governors of Texas and Florida have manufactured, have heightened these problems rather than acting in good faith to help manage or alleviate problems posed by immigration. This anecdote illustrates how the southern border is mythic in the minds of most Americans. Remote and vast, despite living on it myself, I find it somewhat elusive. The border describes a 2,000-mile line separating the United States from Mexico. It traverses 6 Mexican states and 4 U.S. states, 2 of which, Texas and California, are the largest in the country and could not be more different. The border touches the Pacific Ocean near Tijuana and San Diego, and the Atlantic Ocean via the Gulf of Mexico near Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros. While there are similarities, the whole of the border resists simple classification. Despite its variety and complexity, most Americans possess a shared familiar vision of the border. This vision is echoed repeatedly by the media and unverified by personal empirical experience. The predominant way the media produces or reproduces the border through images, media clips, and news magazine articles defines the border as in crisis and as emblematic of America's immigration problem. This imagery is produced and attributed to the border en masse, despite evidence that the immigration crisis is not a problem that can be easily ameliorated or attributed to a single place or policy. Rather, this phenomenon is one of global proportions that threatens only to become larger and more intertwining as unrest in unstable nations and climate change displace greater numbers of people. Thus, I consider how the representations of the border can be used to better understand 21st century conceptions of difference, agency, precarity, education, and democracy. Specifically, as an early childhood art educator, I'm interested in how notions, representations, and policy enacted on the border might inform or be informed by a reconceptualized notion of early childhood education and art education that, according to Thompson, looks at children not as passive materials of biological evolution, nor solely as the recipients and results of cultural imprinting, but as active agents who enter a world of relationships in progress, where they begin to learn and to teach with remarkable success from the first moments of life outside the womb and possibly before that. The work that I do considers the intersections of early childhood art education and the border, and while this space is a unique microcosm often misrepresented or misunderstood in larger discourses, what I hope my writing and work has done is to consider how thinking and learning with this space might speak back to larger discourses of early childhood art education, education, and national geopolitical epistemologies defined by media representations and rhetorical political positionings. What I mean by thinking with or alongside the border does not require an authentic identity as an original borderlands inhabitant. Much has been written and theorized about this important identity of being on the border. Often referred to as fronterizo or fronteriza, to be born on the border, or mestiza, meaning to be constituted of a middle or an in-between race or classification of people, those on the border occupy a unique identity politic wrought in the liminal spaces between binary conceptions and distinctions. Not a fronteriza or a mestiza, I am indebted to those who straddle these spaces, and I feel a responsibility to learn from them and to consider and reconsider my positionality outside of this culture. Considering the various ways that I belong or don't belong to the border helps me to identify subtleties that might inform others as to how to think with or be with without necessarily being of or belonging to a certain group. This is also the positionality of an early childhood educator, and I would argue any art educator working with children pre-K through 12 or researcher. We are always positioned outside of the group that we work with and among. As part of my positionality as outsider, I work to answer questions where once I may have worked under assumptions. Today, I will share 3 questions that have driven my work and that I have felt required answering in order to understand early education as part of border politics. In order to share these questions, today's talk will focus on 3 ideas that are supported by 4 manuscripts. These are ideas that would have been unthinkable without the intersection of the issues of early childhood education and the border. The first is a question of quality addressed in the paper Portate bien con la maestra that my co-author and I examined while working closely with teachers of young children in a local public elementary setting. Borrowing from Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence, early childhood theorists questioning the very notion of quality, this manuscript came about from confronting different positionalities and conceptions of best practice. The paper layers different voices to investigate the residues and reverberations of colonialism through the collision of differing conceptions and questions of quality. The second question, how is liminality artistic and democratic, was initially a question developed during my dissertation research conducted in a Midwestern daycare center. Later, the ideas were adapted to address a deeper question of how does the border liminality of betwixt and between manifest beyond the US-Mexico border, And what are its implications for early childhood education and beyond as part of democratic education or citizenry? The last question, who is visible on the border, nationally, internationally, will make up the bulk of this talk and centers around two papers that explore the intersection of concepts of reconceptualized early childhood education and underpinned contemporary early child art education and those of immigrant precarity. Question 1. Whose notion of quality should be practiced on the border? Playing on the bivocal possibilities afforded by a co-authored paper, my colleague Diane Golding and I explore the questions of best practices and whether progressivism can be guilty of the same colonizing practices that it works against as part of the post-colonial project. While children are not centered as direct research subjects in this piece, the backdrop for this discussion was an early childhood makerspace in a local rural elementary school focusing on pre-K and kindergarten curriculum and teachers. Here, my co-author and I present differing positionalities and understanding of progressive education, which is laid against those of our research team and of the teachers we are working along with to create a progressive makerspace for young children. While I unpack assumptions of progressive best practices in early childhood art education and post-colonial research, my co-author retells the story of growing up on the border and the comportment towards education that was passed along to her and was characteristic of many Mexican-American attitudes towards education. She introduces the idea of portate bien con la maestra, a term insistent on the authority of the teacher and of certain performance of comportment of the learner as obedient or compliant first and foremost. This echoed throughout her education was something that we came to see play out in the research base as our hopes were dashed when the teachers we were working with performed a certain kind of deference to our institutional authority and a certain kind of professionalism. Initially, we found this deference confounding, hoping instead for what we were certain was the more honoring, progressive, or post-colonial approach to research and education, to include the teachers as co-producers of curriculum and of research, and that they would buy into our practice and continue the work as part of their work. Looking closely at this discrepancy between our expectations and the teacher's enactments of unwitting resistance to our practices and ideas through portate bien con la maestra, and while also considering the context of the border created a space to consider whose curriculum, whose progressivism, and whose notion of quality education were at play in the space. Rather than prioritize one as best, we argue that a border notion of quality might be able to hold together competing and contradictory notions of best practice or quality education. Within the notion of mestiza, as described by Anzaldúa, are many conceptions of self, many identities, many cultures held together in contrast, contamination, and complexity. Rather than declare border curricula and border notions of quality entirely at odds with white progressive notions of quality, the border seems to hold space for the possibility of many conceptions and performances or carryings, or tarse, coming from the Spanish word to carry, of quality. The juxtaposition of two representations of quality leads to a deeper understanding of identity, culture, and curriculum on the border. One where competing ways of knowing and being constitute a border space of potential hybridity, contamination, and multiplicity. Ultimately, this multivalent borderlands notion of quality questions the larger utility or supremacy of recognized notions of quality within progressive art education. Here together, the border and early childhood questions of quality proffer the possibility of multiple, competing, and complex notions of quality art education. Question 2. How is liminality artistic and democratic? Towards the end of the charcoal drawing, Miss B asked all the children what their drawings were and inscribed their answers on them. She collected the papers from the children who were finished, though many were still busy. She was planning to display them on the walls of the classroom. Despite her explanations toward collecting his drawings, Bernard tells the assistant teacher, Miss A, that he doesn't want her to keep his. He explains that he would rather hold on to his. Many of his peers are still working on their drawings, and seemingly finished with his, I ask him if he would like another sheet of drawing paper. He says no. Bernard moves the paper away and is left with just the charcoal itself. He refocused his interest and extended his play by adjusting his attention to the charcoal sticks and vine charcoal. With two longer vine charcoals in each hand, Bernard begins to crisscross the two together, mimicking a sword fight while making slurping sound effects that sound like a cross between a cartoony gunshot and a lightsaber. When asked what's going on, he tells me that they, meaning the charcoal, are fighting. The sparring of the vine charcoal ends rather abruptly, and his presumably finished drawing re-enters the video frame. And Bernard returns to making marks on the paper. After a few quick and richly intense black scribbles, Bernard switches his focus back to the drawing implements. This time he explores drawing on the flat, squared off surface of the compressed charcoal with the vine charcoal. The vine charcoal cleaves easily and violently flies off in different directions under the pressure Bernard applies. He lingers with this idea for a while, trying to break different pieces of vine charcoal against the denser compressed charcoal sticks. The smaller ones don't break as easily. I hand him additional compressed charcoal of differing grayscale and ask him, what about the white one? And what if I give you all these to play with? Shoving more of the remaining charcoal into a pile for him. He stops momentarily to get a tissue and returns to the pile as Miss B sings a transition song about putting books back on the shelf, and then another that indicates it's time to sit crisscross applesauce in a circle on the carpet. Instead of moving to the carpet to be with the other children, Bernard lingers at the head of the writing table. He begins counting and sorting the compressed charcoal, which leads to an impromptu counting math lesson that looks and feels a lot like play with base 10 blocks, of which the compressed charcoal resembles the 10 sticks. He counts to 13 using the charcoal and then says 13 plus 13, and then counts out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in the cadence and voice used during teacher-led practice with base 10 blocks. With hands covered in charcoal dust, Bernard then pushes the charcoal across the table in a small pile. An enchanting tink 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 of the colliding charcoal is heard over Miss B's request that another child in center time who is having trouble regulating his behavior move to the safe space. Bernard leans in and pushes the pile toward the center of the table for me to see and states, "Here's the fire." I ask, "That's the fire?" And he confirms, "Yeah, put your hands in it." I move my hands over the fire and change my voice to imitate shivering and warming by the fire. "Ooh, it's so warm." I ask if it's as warm for him, and he shows me his blackened hands, explaining, "Look at this, I got burned." He spreads all 10 fingers to show me his singed hand, while a subtle smirk crosses his face as I exclaim, "Oh no, you got burned!" By now, Miss B has wrangled all the other children to the carpet, and they have begun the song, "Open, shut them, that indicates that circle time discussions are about to begin. Now Bernard is ready to clean up. He helps me and then heads to the circle. From drawing implement to sparring swords, back to drawing implement and violent play, to base 10 counting blocks, to imaginary fire, in a span of 5 minutes, during Bernard's explorative play and art-making practice, the charcoal sticks moved across various ontologies. This kind of ontological and epistemological flexibility is a characteristic of what I call border materials. Drawing from the work of Victor Turner and Glorian Zaldua, I called on the liminality of an unfixed or fluid ontoepistemology to describe the kind of play and thinking going on in children's art explorations. Border materials are materials that are often considered to have an original or primary use, but can be repurposed for another. Border materials are materials whose use might be ambiguous to the user. Border materials are materials that have multiple or disparate uses yet to be determined by the user. They are materials that can straddle the border between art material and non-art material, or art method and non-art method. Because they never settle permanently in either space, they occupy a liminality betwixt and between two spaces or categories of being, or what Jane Bennett referred to as ontological multiple. In spite of this flexibility, it is important to note that these materials still persist. They are in spite of their categorical dismissal of a clear-cut category of being. In other words, they are despite and because of the fact that they shimmer between two understandings of being. This work with Bernard was conducted in a Western daycare center before I moved to El Paso, Texas. It was intended primarily as a way to describe and understand the processes and practices of young children's making and play. But as I mined my dissertation for publishable manuscripts against the backdrop of the newly elected Trump presidency, despite concerning rhetoric and atavistic, backwards-looking practices of the culture wars, I was impelled to consider the application of progressive early childhood education practices and to ask not only how is liminality a characteristic of art and art making, but how is liminality, or what characterizes a border ontology, more specifically characteristic of American democracy and our national character? The paper Border Materials, Early Childhood Art Education, and the Ontological Persistence of American Flexibility addresses this, claiming that the flexible practices that we embrace in progressive early childhood education and those of the people of the border and hybrid identities like Mexican American are indeed strengths and characteristics long cultivated as American and democratic. I contend that our strength is our flexibility, our creative ability to change or adjust without breaking. I explain as the children explored borders that were beyond or between, they were in the process of practicing flexibility and becoming. They were developing an understanding of their own flexible ontological persistent, aware that in order to be or persist, one need not be fixed or rigid or totalized. In other words, exploring and inventing border materials and processes, educators can create students who do not need the rigidity of a totalized American culture. Rather, we can create students who can and will invent and reinvent what it means to be artists. They will not only reinvent and invent what it means to be artists, they will also be flexible, persistent Americans and cosmopolitan citizens of the world. Question 3. Who is visible on the border, nationally, internationally? My work on the intersection of childhood and immigrant precarity was written during the pandemic and in response to a feeling that was growing within me that much of the work that was considered progressive or cutting edge in our field was often about special spaces where early childhood art was found to be exemplar, and research in early childhood art was often conducted in privileged spaces where arts or approaches that hinged on the arts like Reggio and Room 13 were held up as best practices. Guilty of often seeking out privileged faces to conduct my research, I was also not seeing the same kind of understandings, values, and concerns in other early childhood art education spaces that I visited. The cultural concerns of a reconceptualized early childhood practice were not embraced or taken up in the ways that our field practiced. In my experience, where I was able to see these spaces was in rather privileged sites, and often this meant white or well off. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, my research sites shuddered. I turned toward images of the border that troubled me, that seemed to question my privileged positionality and privileged spaces and elitist notions of best practice. Because the pandemic prevented me from turning away, a seed was planted that asked who these privileged spaces were for. Are these spaces indicative of the experience of the whole culture or a majority of children's spaces? And what is my responsibility as an outsider? While I was confronting these positional and purpose-based questions, I was also confronted with terrible images that asked me to reconsider foundational questions of my reconceptualized early childhood philosophy, namely, what is our image of the child? These difficult images compelled me to ask and to face the ghastly answer to these questions. What is our image of the child on the border? And how can a progressive early childhood education researcher stomach or live with the representation, literal images of perished children, and representations of children and caged children and family separations? The underlying assumption of the reconceptualized image of child as laid out by Malaguzzi is fundamentally a question of care, one that asks how best to care for the life, prosperity, and well-being of a child as a recognizable human full of potential and vibrancy. Isolated from the once busy distractions of pre-pandemic life, I began to consider the nagging difficulties of two images of children on the border that confronted my easy and unexamined position as an early childhood art education researcher on the border, and helped me to consider how my progressive positioning might benefit from thinking with the border and vice versa. From the consideration of these two troubling images, I composed two sister manuscripts. One that describes a relational drawing practice of coming to know and be across spatial difference. The other, which I share here, considers how early childhood art education notions of agency and relationality might be thought of in order to render unintelligible others intelligible and grievable. Both manuscripts explore notions of relationality, an important consideration of reconceptualized notions of early childhood education, childhood studies, and early childhood art education. I argue that relationality should be taken up by the broader field of art education, especially in its positioning towards socially engaged practices and social justice, and because of its democratic foundations. In response to recent difficult images of children that have caught national attention, including those of children in cages and the image of a father and daughter who drowned crossing the Rio Grande, I looked into theories of childhood proffered by early childhood art education and childhood studies scholars to make sense of the senseless and to lend visibility to the invisible. I explore notions of visibility, recognition, vulnerability, and agency as they are attributed to two different groups: children and the precarious, which include immigrants, refugees, and non-citizens. I examine differences in how these groups are theorized and ultimately juxtaposed to argue for an emphasis on a more relational understanding of agency, wherein caring, need, and vulnerability are conditions to be considered constitutive of relational agency, and to proffer new understandings of ethical relations between peoples, ones that might impact relational understandings in art education more generally or in early childhood education specifically. Here, relational agency rejects commonly held understandings of agency as something possessed by an individual, and in effect measures the extent of one's separateness, or self-sufficiency, or self-sovereignty. Instead, relational agency embraces notions such as Bashini Kachaba's encounter, Sunday's conviviality, and Schulte's becoming unfaithful, where agency is shared, distributed, and co-constituted. While theorists like Singh laud positives of precarity that indicate post forms of ontology, such as the importance of contaminated interspecies and interactive collaboration, it is important to remember Butler's exhortation that vulnerability is differentiated, that it is allocated differentially across the globe, and that some lives are more grievable than others. Seemingly, children's lives are just that, more grievable than the lives of many adults. This is a product of our ontological understanding of children as a special category in the humanist project as somehow more than and simultaneously less than. Unlike other forms of difference, i.e., race, gender, sexuality, nation, immigration status, childhood is imbued with a narrative of care, vulnerability, and a futural quality. When Butler asks, who counts as human, whose lives count as lives, and finally, what makes for a grievable life, they reveal that notions of viable and grievable life are not givens in the late capitalist humanist project. They are not automatically and evenly distributed among us. Butler claims that for lives to be intelligible as lives, they must be framed as such. They argue the frame that seeks to contain, convey, and determine what is seen, and sometimes for a stretch succeeds in doing that, depends on the conditions of reproducibility in order to succeed. This brings me back to the issue of how to understand images and stories of migrants' children's precarity on the border. In particular, how do we make sense of stories of immigrant children held in cages and the image of an immigrant father and young daughter drowned on the banks of the Rio Grande? Certainly, these lives become grievable because they are intelligible and distributed, but there is more at work than the production and circulation of images. The restriction of access to migrant images is like other restricted images, like those of war. They are used as a way of restricting the field of perception as part of the orchestrative power of the state to control what is perceived to exist. In the rest of the paper, I consider how the image of migrant children is an effective media mechanism through which to lend migrants visibility, viability, and grievability where they usually have none. I consider the special status of care that we lend children and how children are always already constructed as in need or in relation to others. Rather than diminish this neediness, instead I proffer a different viewpoint, one supported by authors examining relationalities of the Anthropocene like Singh and Haraway, who, like Butler, consider all ontologies relational, co-constitutive, contingent, and precarious. I conclude with considerations for art education in general, stating, with the studies of migrant images, together with the discussions of early childhood art education's foundational issues of care and agencies, offer the field of art education is also twofold. First and foremost, this discussion asks art educators to think of children, students, citizens, non-citizens, objects, and materials as interdependent. Here, notions of care often relegated to children and questioned by early childhood art education become a model for interdependent becomings that are based on a human ethic of empathic preservation. Rather than further the art world myth of the lone genius artist or education's interest in developmental individuation and a relational agency might provide new ways of being with others, new knowledge and understandings, and it might ultimately produce new artistic forms. What possibilities might our classroom hold if we move away from the idolization of the accomplishments and agency of the lone individual and of the lone individual artist and embrace the possibilities of an interconnected agency? Finally, art education's discussion of migrant images as frames of war that are seen or consumed by the public stands to expand the importance and scope of our work beyond the classroom, to include the visual education of the public at large, the study of the visual need not to be reserved for the artist alone, and an understanding of how images produce and reproduce power, perpetuate politics, shape our everyday understandings, and recognize or blur subjectivities as an essential aspect of visual arts education. Through close study, we can see how our ideas and values manifest visually, and simultaneously through the study of visuality and visual arts, we can construct new concepts and embrace new ways of knowing and being. Examining precarious images can produce recognition of our or render intelligible precarious relational beings. What I've said here today is a sampling of what thinking on the border might engender when considered with and against notions of reconceptualized early childhood art education. Both areas and communities of study are often set aside from larger art education conversation, but it is my experience that both separately and together in tandem create thinking and engender ideas that are critical to a democratic and flourishing field of art education. I'm in debt to those children and people I work and live side by side with on the border as they shape and shift my understanding. And I believe in the imperative to care for the spaces and cultures of the border and of children. And one of the ways that I do that is to consider and reconsider what I know and to consider these knowledges and their applications to the larger fields and audiences.